5 years into their marriage, David and Helen's organization had helped solve 43 cases of missing persons from the frontier era. Each one represented a family that finally had answers, closure that had eluded them for generations. The work was rewarding but exhausting, and there were times when both of them felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they were trying to do. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A documentary filmmaker named Catherine had been following their work for several months, filming some of their searches and interviewing families they'd helped. She pitched the idea of a television series to a major network, and to everyone's surprise, they went for it. Lost Trails premiered in the fall, and suddenly David and Helen's quiet nonprofit was in the national spotlight. The show wasn't sensationalized or dramatized. Catherine kept it respectful and focused on the human stories, the families searching for answers, and the careful, methodical work of researching and investigating these old cases. Audiences loved it. Within weeks, Lost Trails became one of the network's highest-rated shows. With the show's success came more funding, more volunteers, and many more cases. David and Helen hired a full-time staff. They moved their operation from Helen's home office into an actual building. They brought on professional researchers, field investigators, and forensic specialists. What had started as just the two of them working out of passion and curiosity had become a legitimate organization, making a real difference. But the growth brought challenges too. There were arguments about which cases to take on, debates about how to handle media attention, and stress about managing a growing team. There were nights when David and Helen barely spoke to each other, both too tired and frustrated to communicate well. Running an organization was different from just doing the work they loved. One particularly difficult case nearly broke them. A family in Texas had hired them to find information about an ancestor who'd disappeared in New Mexico in 1889. The research pointed to a specific area, and David spent 3 weeks searching. He found evidence of an old camp, artifacts that matched the time period, but no definitive proof it was the right person. The family was insistent. They wanted David to keep searching, convinced the answer was there. Helen thought they should move on to other cases where they had better leads. David felt obligated to keep trying. They argued about it for days, and it spilled over into other areas of their relationship. Old resentments surfaced. Questions about whether they'd made the right choices, whether the organization had grown too big, whether they'd lost sight of what they were trying to do. It was Helen's grandmother who helped them work through it. At 87, Rose was sharp as ever and had no patience for foolishness. She invited them both to dinner, and after the meal gave them a talking to that neither of them would forget. "You two have built something beautiful," she said, looking at them over her reading glasses. "You've helped dozens of families find peace. You've changed lives, but you're so busy running your organization that you've forgotten why you started it in the first place. This work came from love. Love for history, love for helping people, love for each other. Don't let success kill what made you successful." She was right. David and Helen had gotten so caught up in the growth and management of the organization that they'd stopped doing the work together. They divided responsibilities, each handling different aspects of the operation, and somewhere in that division, they'd lost the partnership that had made them effective. They made changes. They delegated more to their staff, trusting them to handle day-to-day operations. They started working cases together again, doing the research and fieldwork side by side like they had in the early days. They set boundaries between work and personal time, making sure they had evenings and weekends that were just for them. It wasn't an instant fix. Rebuilding what they'd strained took time and effort, but gradually things got better. They remembered why they'd fallen in love in the first place, and they made sure not to forget again. The Texas case eventually resolved when David found a journal entry in a historical archive that provided closure for the family, even though they never located a physical site. Sometimes David learned you couldn't find everything, but you could still help people understand what happened. As their organization matured, David and Helen started thinking bigger. They partnered with universities to train the next generation of historical investigators. They developed new technologies for searching and documenting old sites. They created an online database where families could submit information about missing ancestors, helping connect cases that might be related. The work expanded beyond the American frontier. They started helping families locate missing persons from other time periods and other parts of the world. A case involving a World War II pilot whose plane had crashed in Alaska. A family searching for a merchant sailor who disappeared in the Pacific in the 1920s. Each case was different, but the fundamental mission remained the same: helping families find answers. 10 years after David first followed those tracks in the desert, the organization had helped solve more than 200 cases. They'd been featured in magazines, won awards for their historical work, and changed the way law enforcement and historical societies thought about cold cases from the distant past. But the case that mattered most to both of them would always be William and Eleanor Hartley. That was the one that started it all. The one that showed David his purpose and brought Helen into his life. Every year on the anniversary of the day David found the hidden canyon, he and Helen would visit William and Eleanor's grave in Pennsylvania. They'd bring flowers, sit for a while, and remember how a chance discovery had changed everything. One spring morning, sitting beside those graves, Helen told David she was pregnant. They'd been trying for a couple of years without success and had started to accept that it might not happen for them. But here it was, new life, new beginnings. Their daughter was born in December, and they named her Catherine, after Eleanor's mother. Catherine Eleanor Chen Richardson, a name that honored the past while looking toward the future. David held his daughter for the first time and thought about William Hartley, about how hard he'd tried to give Eleanor a good life, about the love and desperation in those journal entries. Fatherhood changed David's perspective on everything. The work became even more meaningful because now he understood, in a visceral way, what it meant to love a child, to want to protect them, to be willing to do anything for them. He understood William's choices better now, why he'd made the decisions he did, why he'd chosen to stay in that canyon rather than leave Eleanor alone. As Catherine grew, David and Helen told her the story of how they'd met, about the tracks in the desert, the hidden canyon, the journals that documented a tragedy from long ago. They took her to visit William and Eleanor's grave, explaining how those two people she'd never met had brought her parents together and, in a way, made her existence possible. Catherine grew up around the organization, playing in the office while her parents worked, learning to read from old documents and historical records. By the time she was 10, she was helping with research, showing the same passion for history and mystery that her parents shared. The organization continued to grow and evolve. They trained hundreds of volunteers, solved countless cases, and became the leading authority on locating missing persons from historical periods. But success never changed what was at the heart of their work: compassion for families searching for answers, respect for the people whose stories they uncovered, and a commitment to ensuring that even those long dead were not forgotten. David sometimes thought about his old life, back when he was just a geologist collecting soil samples and writing reports. It felt like a different person, someone he barely recognized. That David had been going through the motions, doing work that was fine but not fulfilling. He'd been waiting for something, even if he didn't know what. Those tracks in the desert had been exactly what he was waiting for. They'd led him to tragedy, yes, but also to purpose, to love, to a life that mattered. They'd led him to Helen, to Catherine, to work that made a difference in people's lives. On days when the work was hard, when cases went unsolved or families were disappointed, David would think back to that morning in the Mojave. He remembered the heat, the broken-down truck, the moment of decision when he chose to follow those mysterious grooves across the sand. He remembered squeezing through that narrow gap in the rocks and finding the hidden canyon. He remembered reading William's journals by flashlight, feeling connected across time to a man he'd never met, understanding that everyone's story mattered, that everyone deserved to be remembered. That was what drove him, what got him through the difficult times. The belief that the work mattered, that helping families find their lost ancestors was more than just satisfying curiosity. It was about honoring the past, acknowledging that the people who came before us had dreams and hopes and fears just like we do. It was about ensuring that no one was truly lost or forgotten. Helen understood this about him. It was one of the many reasons they worked so well together. She felt the same way about the work, the same sense of purpose and responsibility. They'd built not just an organization but a legacy, something that would continue long after they were gone, helping families connect with their history and understand where they came from. Sometimes, late at night, David would stand in Catherine's doorway and watch her sleep. And he'd think about how strange and wonderful life could be, how a random mechanical failure in the desert could lead to a chance discovery that would reshape his entire existence, how following his curiosity down an uncertain path had led him to everything that mattered most. The tracks he'd found that day hadn't just led him to William and Eleanor. They'd led him home, to the life he was meant to live, to the family he was meant to have, to the work he was meant to do, all because he'd been willing to follow where they led, even when he didn't know where they were going. David had learned an important lesson in that hidden canyon, one he tried to pass on to Catherine and to the volunteers and staff who worked with them. Life isn't about having all the answers or knowing exactly where you're headed. Sometimes it's about seeing something interesting and having the courage to follow it. Sometimes it's about being open to the unexpected paths that present themselves. Those old tracks in the desert had changed his life forever, and every day David was grateful he'd followed them. The partnership with Helen started casually. She'd emailed David about some family history mystery she was researching, and he'd offer suggestions about how to track down physical evidence or locate historical sites. Sometimes he'd send her geological information about areas where her ancestors had lived, helping her understand the landscape they'd experienced. But after a few months, their collaboration became more serious. Helen had been contacted by several other families who'd heard about the Hartley discovery and wanted help finding their own missing ancestors. People who'd disappeared in the Western Territories during the 1800s, whose stories had been lost to time. There were more of them than David had ever realized. There are thousands of missing persons cases from that era that were never solved, Helen explained one evening. They were sitting in David's apartment surrounded by maps and old documents. People just vanished. They went west looking for gold or silver or a new life, and their families back east never heard from them again. No bodies were ever found, no closure. David looked at the stack of letters Helen had brought. They were from families all over the country, people asking for help, hoping that maybe their ancestors' story could be found the way William and Eleanor's had been. "We can't possibly help all of these people," David said. "No," Helen agreed, "but we could help some of them. And isn't that worth doing?" That conversation changed everything. David started using his vacation time to travel to remote areas, searching for abandoned mining camps and lost trails. Helen would research the historical records, narrowing down possible locations, and David would do the field work. They were a good team. Her attention to detail and his willingness to hike through difficult terrain complemented each other perfectly. Their first success came 6 months after the Hartley burial. A family in Oregon had been searching for information about a great-grandfather who'd disappeared in Nevada in 1892. Helen had found references to a mining claim he'd filed, and David located the general area. It took 3 trips and countless hours of searching, but finally David found the remains of a camp. And in that camp, wrapped in oilcloth and miraculously preserved, a letter the man had written to his wife, explaining that he was coming home. He'd never made it. The Oregon family was grateful. They held a memorial service and finally had a place to honor their ancestor. But more importantly, word spread. Local news covered the story, then regional news. Then a national magazine did a feature article about David and Helen's work. Suddenly, they weren't just helping the occasional family. They were getting requests from all over the country. People who'd been researching their family histories for years but had hit dead ends. People who just wanted to know what had happened to their ancestors. The demand was overwhelming. David was still working his geology job, trying to do this work on the side, and it was becoming impossible. He was exhausted, sleeping only a few hours a night, spending every weekend and evening on research or fieldwork. Something had to give. The decision came one night when he was sitting at his desk at work, staring at a report about soil composition that needed to be finished by morning. He'd been working on it for 3 hours and had barely written a page. His mind kept drifting to a case Helen had sent him, a family in Montana looking for information about a grandmother who'd disappeared in 1895. There was a promising lead, a reference to a homestead in a specific area, and David wanted to be out there searching for it, not sitting in an office writing about sediment samples. He realized, in that moment, that he'd already made his choice. His heart wasn't in this job anymore. Maybe it never really had been. He'd become a geologist because he liked science and the outdoors, and it had been fine. But fine wasn't enough anymore. Not after he'd experienced what it felt like to do work that actually mattered to people. The next morning, David gave his 2 weeks' notice. His supervisor was shocked. "You're throwing away a 20-year career for what? Chasing ghosts in the desert?" When David put it that way, it did sound a little crazy, but David knew it was the right decision. "I'm not chasing ghosts," he said. "I'm helping people find their families. I'm helping them find closure. And yeah, maybe that's not as stable or practical as this job, but it matters more." The conversation with Helen was easier. She was excited. "I've been thinking the same thing," she admitted. "I love teaching, but this work we're doing, it feels more important somehow. What if we made this official? Created a nonprofit organization? Maybe got some grants to fund the work?" They spent the next few months making it happen. Helen had experience with nonprofit organizations through her work with the Historical Society. They filed the paperwork, created a board of directors, set up a website. They called it the Western Heritage Search Project, and their mission was simple: to locate and identify missing persons from the American frontier era and bring closure to their families. The work wasn't easy. They learned quickly that running a nonprofit involved a lot more than just doing the research and fieldwork they loved. There was fundraising, paperwork, dealing with various government agencies, coordinating with law enforcement and historical preservation offices. Sometimes David wondered if they'd made a mistake. But then they'd get a call from a family member who'd just learned what happened to their ancestor. They'd see the relief and gratitude in people's faces when they finally had answers after generations of wondering. And David knew they'd made the right choice. Their third major case took them to Montana, following up on that lead about the missing grandmother. It took weeks of research and multiple trips to the area, but they finally located an old homestead. The building had collapsed decades ago, but the foundation was still there. And in what had been the root cellar, they found a trunk full of personal belongings. Inside was a diary. The woman had made it to her homestead, had survived several years there, but had died during a particularly harsh winter. Her diary entries talked about her children back east, about how much she missed them, about her plans to bring them west once she'd established herself. She died before she could make that happen. Helen contacted the family, great-great-grandchildren who'd never known what happened to their ancestor. They'd always assumed she'd started a new life somewhere and forgotten about her old family. Learning the truth, that she'd never forgotten them, that she'd died still planning to reunite with them, was emotional but healing. Cases like that kept David and Helen going through the difficult times. And there were difficult times. Months where funding was tight and they weren't sure how they'd keep the organization running. Searches that turned up nothing, leaving families still without answers. Conflicts with authorities who didn't understand what they were trying to do or didn't think it was important. But slowly, the organization grew. They brought on volunteers, historians, and researchers, and retired law enforcement officers who wanted to help. They developed relationships with various state and federal agencies. They got better at the work, more efficient, more thorough. And somewhere in the middle of all this, David and Helen became more than just business partners. It happened gradually. Long hours working together turned into dinner meetings that weren't really about work. Research trips started including sightseeing and conversations that had nothing to do with missing persons. They started calling each other just to talk. Not because there was a case to discuss. David wasn't sure exactly when he fell in love with Helen. Maybe it was watching her carefully restore an old photograph, her face intent with concentration. Maybe it was listening to her talk about history with passion and excitement. Maybe it was the way she treated every family they worked with, even the difficult ones, with patience and compassion. Or maybe it had been happening all along, from that first meeting in the coffee shop, and he'd just been too focused on the work to notice. Helen later told him she'd fallen for him during a research trip to Arizona. They'd been searching for evidence of an old mining camp, hiking through difficult terrain in the heat. David had twisted his ankle badly, but instead of giving up, he'd kept going because he knew how important this search was to the family who'd hired them. Helen said it was his determination, his refusal to quit even when things got hard, that made her realize he was someone special. They didn't make a big deal about their relationship. It just sort of evolved naturally from partnership to friendship to something more. One evening, they were working late at Helen's house, and David leaned over to point out something in a document she was reading, and somehow they ended up kissing. It felt right, like it had been building to that moment all along. 6 months later, David asked Helen to marry him. They were standing beside the spring in the hidden canyon, where he'd found William and Eleanor's story. The site had become special to both of them, a reminder of how their partnership had started. Helen said yes before David even finished asking the question. They got married on a Saturday in June, a simple ceremony with family and friends and several of the families they'd helped over the years. In his vows, David thanked Helen for showing him that it was never too late to find your purpose, to change your path, to do work that mattered. In her vows, Helen thanked David for his courage in following those tracks in the desert, for caring enough about a century-old tragedy to track down her family, for helping bring William and Eleanor home. Standing there, holding Helen's hands and looking into her eyes, David thought about that day his truck had broken down in the desert. If someone had told him then that following those old tracks would lead him here, to this moment, to this life, he never would have believed it. But life had a way of surprising you sometimes. All you had to do was be willing to follow where it led. David made it back to his truck just as the tow truck was arriving. The driver, a weathered man named Pete, who'd probably rescued dozens of stranded motorists from this stretch of desert, gave him a knowing look. "Got some walking in, did you?" "Yeah," David said, not quite ready to explain where he'd been or what he'd found. Had to kill time somehow. The drive back to town was quiet. David sat in the passenger seat of the tow truck, watching the desert roll by, but his mind was miles away. He kept seeing those journals. William Hartley's careful handwriting documenting the slow tragedy of his final months. He kept thinking about Eleanor, a 7-year-old girl who died in that hidden canyon, buried beside a spring that still flowed all these years later. When they got to the garage, David arranged for his truck repairs and caught a ride to his motel. He should have been thinking about work, about the samples he hadn't collected, about the report he'd need to file explaining why today had been a complete loss, productivity-wise. Instead, all he could think about was William and Eleanor Hartley. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and finally, around 2 a.m, he got up and opened his laptop. He started searching. William Hartley, Pennsylvania, 1887. Missing persons, mining expeditions, anything that might give him more information about the people whose story had affected him so deeply. The internet wasn't as helpful as he'd hoped. Records from the 1880s were spotty at best, and not everything had been digitized. But David was persistent. He searched through genealogy websites, historical society databases, old newspaper archives. Hours passed. The sun came up. David kept searching. Finally, around 9 a.m, he found something. A brief mention in a Pennsylvania newspaper from 1887. Local man missing. The article was short, just a few lines. William Hartley, age 34, and his daughter Eleanor, age 7, had departed for the Western Territories in March of that year. They were last heard from in April. The family was requesting any information about their whereabouts. David sat back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. So William had family back east, people who'd wondered what happened to him and his daughter, people who'd probably never stopped wondering, and now, more than 130 years later, David had the answer. But what was he supposed to do with it? He spent the next week wrestling with that question. He went through the proper channels at work, reporting the historical site he'd discovered. His supervisor was excited about the find, but also concerned about David's unauthorized exploration. "You could have gotten hurt," he said. "What if you'd fallen in that mine? What if the ceiling had collapsed?" David knew his boss was right, but he also knew he'd do the same thing again. Some discoveries were worth the risk. The company contacted the appropriate authorities. A team from the State Historical Preservation Office came out to the site. David led them through the narrow passage into the hidden canyon. He showed them the spring, the old camp, the mine entrance. He watched as they carefully documented everything, photographed every detail, examined every artifact. When they brought out the journals, handling them with gloved hands and placing them in protective cases, David felt a strange sense of loss. Those journals had connected him to William and Eleanor in a profound way. Watching them being taken away felt like saying goodbye to friends he'd never actually met. But the historical team was thrilled. "This is an incredible find," the lead archaeologist told him. "Personal accounts from this period are rare, especially ones this well preserved. These journals will be invaluable for understanding what life was like for mining families in the 1880s. Over the following weeks, David couldn't let it go. He kept researching, spending his evenings at the library making calls to historical societies in Pennsylvania, tracking down every lead he could find about the Hartley family. It became almost an obsession. He needed to know more about these people. He needed to understand their full story, not just the tragic ending. He found census records showing William Hartley had been a school teacher before heading west. He found a marriage certificate from 1879. He found Eleanor's birth record. He found a death certificate for her mother, dated January 1887. She'd died of pneumonia, which explained William's journal entry about Eleanor missing her mother. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd been desperate. He'd lost his wife, he'd had a young daughter to care for, and teaching didn't pay enough to support them. So he'd done what many men did in that era. He'd headed west hoping to make his fortune, hoping to give his daughter a better life. Instead, he died in a hidden canyon in the Mojave Desert, along with the daughter he'd been trying to save. 3 months after the discovery, David got a call that changed everything. It was from a woman named Helen Richardson. She was a genealogist, and she'd been contacted by the Historical Preservation Office because her research overlapped with the Hartley family. She'd been researching her own family history and discovered that her great-great-grandfather had been William Hartley's brother. "I've been trying to find out what happened to William and Eleanor for 5 years," she told David over the phone. Her voice was shaking with emotion. "We always knew they'd gone west and never came back. But we never knew what happened to them. And now, after all this time, you found them." David agreed to meet with Helen. She drove out from Colorado, where she lived, and they met at a coffee shop in town. Helen was in her 50s, a high school history teacher with kind eyes and her great-great-great-uncle's same careful, precise way of speaking. She brought old photographs. William as a young man, serious and thin, with Eleanor as a toddler on his lap. Eleanor's mother, whose name had been Catherine, looking tired but happy in a formal portrait. Family letters, documents, records Helen had collected over years of research. "I always felt connected to them," Helen said, spreading the papers across the table. "I know that sounds silly. They died more than a century ago. I never knew them. But family matters, you know. History matters. And I hated not knowing what happened to them." David showed her the copies he'd made of the journal entries that had been cleared for public viewing. He watched Helen read them, tears streaming down her face as she learned the story of her ancestors' final months. "He was trying so hard," she whispered. "He was doing everything he could to save her." They talked for hours. Helen told David about the Hartley family, about the people William had left behind. 2 brothers and a sister, all of whom had wondered and worried and eventually had to accept that William and Eleanor were gone. None of them had ever known about the hidden canyon, the spring, the mine, or the journals that documented their final days. "What happens now?" David asked. Helen had thought about this. She'd already been in contact with the Historical Preservation Office and the authorities handling the site. "They found the remains," she said quietly. "William and Eleanor. The preservation team located them near the spring, just like William wrote in his journal. They've been there all this time." David nodded. He'd known the team would find them, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a different way. "I want to bring them home," Helen said. "The family does. We've talked about it. All of us who are descended from William's siblings. We want William and Eleanor buried properly, in the family plot in Pennsylvania next to Catherine. They should be together." Over the next few months, David and Helen worked together to make that happen. It involved lawyers and permits and historical preservation protocols. It involved coordinating with multiple states and dealing with bureaucracy that seemed designed to make everything as difficult as possible. But finally, on a cold day in November, more than 130 years after they'd left Pennsylvania, William and Eleanor Hartley came home. The burial was small but meaningful. Members of the Hartley family came from across the country. The local historical society sent representatives. David was there, feeling oddly emotional about saying goodbye to 2 people he'd never met but had come to care about deeply. Helen gave a eulogy. She talked about William's courage in trying to provide for his daughter. She talked about Eleanor, who'd been just a little girl caught up in her father's dream. She talked about love and loss and how family connections transcend time. After the ceremony, as people were leaving, Helen pulled David aside. "Thank you," she said, "for finding them, for caring enough to track down our family, for helping bring them home. You gave us closure we never thought we'd have." David didn't quite know what to say. He'd just been following some tracks in the desert. He'd just been curious, but somehow that curiosity had led him here, to this moment, helping a family finally lay their ancestors to rest. "I'm glad I could help," he said finally. Helen smiled. "You know, I was thinking, I've been researching family history for years, but I've never been very good at the fieldwork side of things. And you're clearly good at finding things. Maybe we could work together sometime. There are a lot of stories out there waiting to be discovered." David looked at her and something clicked in his mind. He thought about his job, collecting soil samples day after day, writing reports no one read, following the same routine year after year. And he thought about the past few months, the excitement of discovery, the satisfaction of helping solve a historical mystery, the feeling that he was doing something that actually mattered. "Yeah," he said slowly, "I'd like that." Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple conversation was the beginning of something bigger. The discovery of William and Eleanor Hartley in that hidden canyon wasn't just the end of their story. It was the beginning of David's new path, one that would take him places he never imagined. David stepped fully into the hidden canyon, and the change was dramatic. Outside, the desert had been brutal, all heat and glare and endless sky. In here, it felt like entering a different world. The rock walls rose at least 60 feet on either side, creating a natural corridor that blocked out most of the sun. The air was cooler, noticeably so, and there was something else. A smell, moisture, that shouldn't be possible. This part of the Mojave got maybe 4 inches of rain a year if it was lucky. Yet David could distinctly smell damp earth and vegetation. He moved forward slowly, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The tracks he'd been following were clearer here, protected from the wind and weather that had eroded them elsewhere. They led deeper into the canyon, toward a bend he couldn't see around. As his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, David started noticing other things. There were marks on the canyon walls, places where the rock had been chipped away. Not natural erosion, but deliberate strikes. Someone had been here before. Someone had modified this place. His pulse quickened. He rounded the bend and stopped dead in his tracks. There, nestled against the far wall of the canyon, was a spring. Actual water, trickling out from between 2 rocks and forming a small pool before disappearing into the ground. Around the spring, incredibly, grew patches of desert grass and even a few scraggly bushes. Life, thriving in this hidden pocket away from the harsh world outside. But it wasn't the spring that made David's breath catch. It was what surrounded it. The remains of a camp. Old, clearly very old, but unmistakably human-made. There were posts driven into the ground, weathered gray by time. Scattered pieces of rusted metal, what looked like the remnants of a canvas tent, now just shreds of fabric too deteriorated to identify. And there, half buried in the sand, the edge of a wooden crate. David approached carefully, as if he were walking through a museum. In a way, he was. This was a piece of history, untouched and undiscovered, waiting all these years for someone to find it. He knelt beside the crate and gently brushed away the sand. The wood was dry and cracked, but still solid. There were faint markings on the side, too faded to read clearly. He looked around the camp more carefully now, his geologist training kicking in. He could read the layers of sand and debris like pages in a book. This camp was old, really old. Based on the weathering of the metal and wood, and the depth of the sand accumulation, he'd guess it had been abandoned for well over 100 years. Late 1800s, maybe, the time of prospectors and miners, people who'd ventured into the desert looking for silver or gold. Near the spring, partially concealed by one of the bushes, David spotted something else. A shape too regular to be natural. He pushed aside the branches and found himself looking at an entrance. A mine entrance. Someone had dug into the canyon wall, creating a shaft that disappeared into darkness. Heavy iron bars had been placed across the opening, probably to keep animals out or to secure whatever was inside. But time had done its work. The bars were rusted through in several places, and one section had collapsed entirely, leaving a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. David knew he should probably stop here. He should document what he'd found, head back to his truck, and report this to the proper authorities. There were procedures for this kind of discovery, but he'd already broken most of the rules just by being here. And besides, he was a scientist. Discovery was what drove him. He checked his water again. Still had plenty. He had time. He squeezed through the gap in the bars, clicking on his flashlight as he entered the mine. The shaft was surprisingly well constructed, with wooden support beams still holding up the ceiling after all these years. The air was cool and dry, perfect conditions for preservation. The floor was littered with debris, chunks of rock that had fallen from the ceiling, old tools, rusted and barely recognizable. About 20 feet in, the shaft opened into a larger chamber. This must have been where they'd done most of their work, digging and sorting through rock looking for whatever precious metal they'd hoped to find. David swept his flashlight around the space, and that's when he saw them. Against the far wall, protected from the elements, scattered across the ground and on a makeshift shelf carved into the rock. Personal belongings. His hands were shaking slightly as he approached. There was a metal cup, dented but intact, a leather satchel, dried and cracked but still in one piece, a small cooking pot, and there, sitting on the rock shelf as if waiting for someone to return, a stack of books. David picked up the top one carefully. It was a journal, the leather cover worn but still holding together. He opened it slowly, mindful of the fragile pages. The first page had writing in faded ink but still legible. The handwriting was neat and precise, each letter carefully formed. And there at the top of the first page, a name and date, property of William Hartley, April 1887. David's heart was racing now. This was real. This was someone's actual life preserved in these pages. He turned to the first entry, angling his flashlight to read the faded words. "We have been in the desert for 3 weeks now," it read. "The others are confident we will find silver here." The geological surveys were promising, but I confess, I am less interested in silver than I am in simply keeping Eleanor safe and providing her with a future. She misses her mother terribly, as do I. But we must move forward. There is nothing left for us in Pennsylvania. Eleanor, a daughter. William Hartley hadn't been out here alone. David carefully turned more pages, reading entries about the mining operation, about the daily struggles of desert life, about a little girl learning to help her father. The entries were mundane at first, typical accounts of work and weather and the slow progress of the mine. Then the tone changed. David found an entry dated 3 months later. "The water situation has become critical. Peterson discovered contamination in our main supply. We suspect it happened when the barrel split in the heat. 3 of the men have fallen ill. We are rationing what clean water remains." David kept reading, unable to stop now. The entries became more desperate. One by one, the other members of the party died. William wrote about burying them, about his growing fear, about his determination to keep his daughter alive. And then an entry that made David sit down right there on the mine floor. "Today I found salvation. While searching for any possible water source, I discovered a narrow passage in the rocks. It leads to a hidden canyon, and there, impossible as it seems, a spring. The water is clean and cold. Eleanor and I moved our camp there immediately. We are the only ones left now, but at least we have water. We have a chance." David looked up from the journal, his flashlight beam steady on the opposite wall. He was sitting in the very mine William Hartley had written about, more than 130 years ago. The man had found the same spring David had seen, had made the same discovery, had saved himself and his daughter, at least temporarily. But there were more journals. David could see 3 others on the shelf. If William and Eleanor had survived, if they'd made it out, these journals wouldn't still be here. No one would leave something this precious behind. With a heavy feeling in his chest, David reached for the second journal. The entries continued. William wrote about their new life in the canyon, about teaching Eleanor to read using the one book they had with them, about exploring the area, about making their hidden sanctuary as comfortable as possible. He wrote about his plans to eventually make the journey back to civilization, once he was sure they were strong enough for the trip. But there was a problem. David could see it building in the entries. Eleanor wasn't getting stronger. She was getting weaker. William wrote about her cough, about her fatigue, about his growing panic as he realized his daughter was seriously ill, and there was nothing he could do about it. The third journal was harder to read. William's handwriting became shakier, the entries shorter and more anguished. He wrote about Eleanor's fever, about her pain, about feeling helpless and desperate. He wrote about talking to her for hours, telling her stories, trying to keep her spirits up even as his own hope faded. David had to stop reading several times. This wasn't just history. This was real human suffering preserved in ink on paper. A father watching his daughter die and being unable to do anything about it. The final journal was small, barely 20 pages. Most of it was blank. There were only a handful of entries, and David almost didn't want to read them. But he'd come this far. He owed it to William and Eleanor to know their full story. The last entry was brief. The handwriting was barely controlled, words scrawled across the page. I buried Eleanor today beside the spring where the grass grows. She was 7 years old. I cannot leave her here alone. I will not leave her. This canyon will be our home forever. If anyone ever finds this, know that we were here. Know that we mattered. David sat in the darkness of the mine, holding the journal, and felt tears running down his face. He wasn't usually an emotional person, but something about this story had broken through all his usual defenses. Here was a man who'd lost everything, who'd tried so hard to save his daughter, and who'd chosen to stay with her even in death rather than save himself. The rational part of David's brain was already thinking about what came next. This was an important historical find. These remains needed to be treated with respect and dignity. William and Eleanor Hartley deserved to have their story told, to be remembered. But right now, sitting in this mine that had become a tomb, David just felt a profound sadness for two people he'd never met, whose lives had ended in this hidden place over a century ago. He carefully placed the journals back on the shelf exactly as he'd found them. He'd need to come back with proper equipment, with people who knew how to preserve historical artifacts. But for now, he needed to get back to his truck. His rescue team would be arriving soon, and he had a lot to explain. The morning started like any other Tuesday for David Chen. He'd been working as a geologist for almost 20 years, and honestly, most days felt pretty much the same. Wake up before dawn, drive out to some remote location, collect soil samples, take measurements, and head back before the desert heat became unbearable. It wasn't glamorous work, but David loved it. There was something peaceful about being out in the vast emptiness of the Mojave Desert, away from the noise and chaos of the city. That particular morning, David had driven about 30 miles outside of the nearest town, following dirt roads that barely qualified as roads at all. His old pickup truck handled the terrain well enough, though it had seen better days. The odometer had stopped working somewhere around 200,000 miles, and the air conditioning only worked when it felt like it. But the truck was reliable, or at least it had been until that moment. The engine made a sound David had never heard before. It wasn't a knock or a rattle, but something deeper, more final. He pressed the gas pedal, but the truck just coasted to a stop in the middle of nowhere. David sat there for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, staring out at the endless expanse of sand and rock ahead of him. Of all the days for his truck to die, it had to be when he was miles from anywhere. He popped the hood and took a look. But David was a geologist, not a mechanic. He could identify 50 different types of sedimentary rock, but car engines were a mystery to him. The heat radiating from the metal was intense, and he quickly closed the hood. He pulled out his phone, already knowing what he'd find. No signal. Out here, cell towers were as rare as water. David had a satellite phone in his equipment bag for emergencies like this. He made the call to his company's dispatch, and they assured him someone would come. But it would take at least 3 or 4 hours. Maybe longer. He had plenty of water, some snacks, and his work to keep him busy, so waiting wasn't really a problem. But sitting in the truck in the rising heat wasn't appealing either. He decided to walk around a bit. The survey site he'd been heading toward was only about half a mile away anyway, so he grabbed his backpack, made sure he had water in his GPS unit, and set off on foot. The sun was climbing higher now, and the temperature was already pushing past 90 degrees. By noon it would be well over 100. David pulled his hat down low and kept moving. The landscape out here was beautiful in its own harsh way. Most people looked at the desert and saw nothing, just empty space. But David saw the story of millions of years written in the rocks and soil. He saw the remnants of ancient seas, the evidence of volcanic activity, the slow work of wind and water shaping the earth. Every stone had a history. He'd been walking for about 20 minutes when something caught his eye. At first he thought it was just a trick of the light, shadows playing across the uneven ground. But as he got closer, he realized he was looking at tracks, not animal tracks or tire marks, but something else entirely. Two parallel grooves, each about 6 inches wide and maybe 3 inches deep, cutting across the hardened desert floor. David knelt down to get a better look. The tracks were old, really old. The edges were worn smooth by decades of wind and occasional rain. Whatever had made these marks had done so a long time ago, maybe 50 years, maybe more. But what really caught his attention was how deliberate they looked. These weren't random marks. Something heavy had been dragged across the sand, leaving these deep impressions that had somehow survived all this time. His scientific curiosity kicked into high gear. In all his years working in the desert, he'd never seen anything quite like this. The tracks seemed to lead toward a ridge of rocks in the distance, cutting a straight line across the landscape. David checked his GPS, marked his current location, and made a decision that would change everything. He started following the tracks. The rational part of his brain told him this was probably a bad idea. He was already stranded, help was hours away, and wandering off into the desert following mysterious tracks wasn't exactly following standard safety protocols. But David had spent his entire career playing it safe, sticking to the plan, doing what he was supposed to do. And right now, staring at these ancient marks in the sand, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, pure unbridled curiosity. He took photos of the tracks with his phone, even though he had no signal to send them anywhere. He measured them, noted their direction, and kept detailed notes in his field book. Every 100 yards or so, he'd stop and mark his location on the GPS. He wasn't being completely reckless. He could follow his markers back to the truck anytime he wanted. The tracks led him away from the road, deeper into terrain that few people probably ever visited. The ground got rougher with more rocks and less sand, but the tracks were still there, persistent, leading him forward. David found himself wondering about the person who'd made them. What had they been doing out here? What had they been dragging? And why had they come to this particular spot so far from everything? After about an hour of walking, he noticed the landscape was changing. The flat desert floor was giving way to more dramatic rock formations. Massive boulders, some as big as houses, jutted up from the earth. The tracks were harder to follow here, sometimes disappearing entirely where the ground was too hard to hold an impression. But whenever David thought he'd lost them, they'd appear again, guiding him forward. He checked his water. He'd already drunk half of what he'd brought, and the heat was getting intense. The smart thing would be to turn back now, head to the truck, and wait for his rescue. But the tracks were leading toward something. He could see a cluster of rock formations ahead that looked different from the surrounding area. Just a little further, he told himself, just to see where they led. As he got closer to the rocks, David noticed something odd. There was a gap between two massive stone formations, a narrow opening that wasn't visible from a distance. The tracks led straight toward it. His heart was pounding now, and it wasn't just from the heat and exertion. He had the distinct feeling that he was about to discover something important. The opening was tight, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. David hesitated. Going into an unknown space alone with no one knowing where he was violated every safety rule he'd ever learned. But he'd come this far. He pulled out his flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped into the narrow passage.